Okay, so this video here will be kind of short. I didn't realize that I was down to the last slide here, but I also didn't have enough time to finish it in the previous video. So here, um, plain view um, is not affected whenever we shift position. Um, so if I'm standing in your living room and I see something that piques my interest hiding behind your TV, and I lean over one way or the other to give myself a better view, that doesn't constitute a search. It doesn't invalidate plain view, anything like that. So as long as my shifting position doesn't violate the Fourth Amendment, um, and it doesn't exceed the scope of the prior valid justification for prior intrusion, then plain view applies. So, a lot of times somebody might wonder, how could you violate the Fourth Amendment here? Well, so your car, let's say on a traffic stop, I'm there at your car and you have the driver's window down. I ask you for your insurance, and you say, yeah, just a second, and lean over to the glove box to grab it out of there. If I stick my head through the window of your car to look down into like the kick panel on the driver's side door, there I have broken the plane of your vehicle, and I don't have a lawful right to break that plane at that point. And so by shifting position there, anything that I see down there is excluded. But now, if I normally would stand at the B pillar, which is it's where the front door of your vehicle latches. If I'm standing there and I shift myself around to the A pillar, which is where the hinge is. So, looking here on the screen, this right here would be the B pillar, and this right here would be the A pillar right here. So if I start out right here and then I shift up to this pillar to look in, back across this way, that is perfectly okay, so long as I don't break the plane of the window. So closer examination is one. There's actually an interesting piece of case law in your textbook that talks about this one. The information was actually excluded based on something else, but the Supremes actually said that closer examination in itself does not violate plain view. So in this instance, the guys had received consent for like drugs or something, and they turned a VCR that they believed to be stolen around to read the serial numbers off of it and call it in to check and see if it was stolen. And once they did, they put it back. The Supremes said that as far as plain view for the purpose of determining whether or not the VCR was stolen, that is perfectly acceptable. However, the information obtained on that was excluded in that case because they excluded the scope of the consent they were given to search for drugs, because it was not reasonable to believe that drugs would be located behind the VCR. Because the thing is, they could see behind the VCR to tell there were no drugs there, but they couldn't see the serial number. And in moving the VCR there, they exceeded the scope of the consent for the drugs. But in itself, if they had asked, can we search for stolen property, and the guy had said yes, then it would have been perfectly acceptable. So in itself, closer examination is not a violation of plain view. You just have to make sure that it doesn't exceed the scope of your valid justification. Also, plain view works whenever the contents of something can be inferred. Um, so um, let's say you've got some guy heading out and or you're searching a car, or you look into a car, you're standing there at the B pillar on a traffic stop, you look into the car down at the center console and you see what appears to be a marijuana grinder. And it's got a pot leaf on top of it, like an enameled pot leaf. It's decorative of sorts. Um, Clearly, the contents of that item can be inferred because I have, in my years in law enforcement, I have only once ever come across somebody that used one of those grinders for tobacco. Everybody else uses them for marijuana. So finding that, you can say, obviously, that's going to contain marijuana and it is in plain view, so you can seize it. So that would be a good example of contents being inferred. And then, of course, the other thing is inadvertence is not required. You can actually purposefully um, shift position, closer examination, all of these sorts of things. You can purposefully obtain a search warrant for what you know in order to be probative for what you don't know. It's just so long as you don't exceed the scope of the original search warrant, you don't exceed the scope of the valid and justification for prior police intrusion. Um, Inadvertence is not required. You don't have to stumble upon the item of evidence. You can purposefully be looking for items of contraband in plain view under this exception to the warrant requirement. So, kind of hope that helps you understand plain view a little bit better. And we'll talk about my favorite exception to the search warrant requirement, the automobile exception, coming up here in Chapter 11.